Hello, everyone, and we are going to focus today on decolonization. So we've been in Unit 8, and again, with the AP exam just lurking on the horizon, we're trying to pick up our pace by condensing a lot of information into these lectures. So today we're going to be focusing on decolonization. But what we're going to do is we're going to knock out three different topics for Unit 8. So far for Unit 8, we've dealt with the Cold War. And we've also dealt, well, now it's decolonization. So we've talked about the Cold War, the spread of communism, and now we'll talk about decolonization. And this will actually wrap up Unit 8 for our information. So the first thing that I want to introduce is this idea of the big idea of decolonization. So after World War II, we have two big developments, decolonization and the Cold War. And they're happening simultaneously and they are interacting with one another. So you don't want to view these in isolation as like things that are ignoring the other thing going on. They're happening together and they're influencing one another. So the first thing is this idea that these decolonization movements after World War II have their roots in the interwar years, post-World War I. So these are ongoing colonial tensions. Now, we already know from the age of imperialism in the 19th century, there are plenty of examples of resistance to imperialism. But the notion of creating independent nationalist states out of these colonies is going to pick up steam throughout the interwar years after World War I. If you remember, the Treaty of Versailles was viewed by a lot of these colonies as a slap in the face. Many of them were expecting autonomy after helping to support the Allied causes. And others saw what happened, the benefits that people like Japan, Japan, Britain, and France received from the treaty was at the expense of the colonies. So what this did was it created a greater separation between the colonial powers and the colonies themselves. So for the interwar years, there was already this movement towards independence, towards decolonization. World War II is what accelerates that movement because World War II is devastating to the European economy and to the European powers. Particularly Britain and France just simply don't have the resources to maintain a global empire. And that's the biggest thing that comes out of World War II is that these two countries, Britain and France, they can no longer maintain those imperial powers. The second thing that comes out of World War II is this notion that this war was just fought against the Nazis and their attempt to subject the people to a single rule. In a way, the Nazis were engaging in a form of imperialism, but their imperialism was located in Europe. So the idea that the Nazis were an evil regime bent on world domination suddenly showed that these countries like Britain and France would be hypocritical in maintaining their colonial possessions across the globe. And then the final thing about World War II that I think matters is that after this, you have this competition of the Soviet Union and the United States, which we call the Cold War. And these two countries are not necessarily looking to build empires. They're looking to exert greater influence, but they're not looking to control the states the way the European powers did. So World War II, the last one, this is actually the real last one, is that Japan disrupted the colonial empires throughout Asia. So when Japan is defeated, there's a question of whether or not Europe is going to be able to reassert itself into Asia and create those colonial empires again. And the answer, of course, is going to be no. So in a lot of ways, the Japanese empire, as hated as it was throughout Asia, does disrupt and dislodge the presence of European and Americans in those Asian states. And that's going to contribute to decolonization as well. So World War II is a critical part of leading us into decolonization. Third, the decolonization movement is largely focused around the 1950s to the 1970s. It starts in the 1940s, but the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s is where we really start to see the colonies gain their independence. particularly in Africa and Asia. And then the last thing is that with this decolonization, we have a lot of new nations, independent nations that are bound together by nationalist identity. However, with these new nations come new challenges, because even though they may be enjoying autonomy and independence, they still are economically underdeveloped compared to countries like the US and Soviet Union, Britain, France, Germany. Even though those countries are recovering, they're further advanced industrially than these new nations are. Also, the economies of these new nations have historically been dependent upon export economies. And so the idea is that these new nations, while they may have their economy is still very much wrapped up in those more industrially developed economies of West Europe and the United States. And then finally, the political leadership is going to be presented with conflict and challenges. Because one thing that everybody agreed with was that the colonies should be freed. Once the colonies became independent, the vision of the future varied within those former colonies, eventually leading to political conflict, potentially civil war as well. And we see that throughout Asia and Africa in particular, but also within Latin America. So we're going to go ahead and get to the details of decolonization. And the first thing we want to talk about, and this is from topic 8.5, so this is the first of the three topics, are the nationalist leaders involved in decolonization. So for every colony that gains their freedom, there is some leader that helps to lead and becomes sort of the father or mother of the nation. And in South Asia, which eventually will become India and Pakistan, you have the Indian National Congress, but also specifically Gandhi. And we've talked about Gandhi before, how the Gandhi movement helps to create this nationalistic rejection of the British presence. And the Gandhi movement was based on a nonviolent strategy, which was meant to boycott British goods and to pressure the British out of India. In the end, you will have a two-state solution within South Asia, where the Hindus, well, where there will be a country called India and another country called Pakistan. And the idea is that India would be the nation for Hindus and Pakistan would be the nation for the Muslims. And that gets back to that idea that even though there's independence, there's now these two states that have completely different religion, different culture, different views on what that region should look like. And that's going to lead to competition between these two nations that still goes on today. In the French Indochina, so when we say French Indochina, we tend to just focus on Vietnam. But when you really talk about the French Indochina, you're talking about Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Those three nations make up what was the French Indochina. So French Indochina in the 19th century is part of the French Empire. Japan is going to drive out the French, take over this region. Japan loses, and now the question is will France be able to reassert itself? And there's a nationalist movement led by Ho Chi Minh. So Ho Chi Minh is a revolutionary. He is not engaging in nonviolent protest. He is willing to use violence to oust the Europeans and their presence within French Indochina. So the fallout of World War II is that the Japanese are kicked out, but the French are trying to reassert themselves. And the Ho Chi Minh movement, the nationalist movement of Ho Chi Minh, is going to fight back against the French. And there will be a famous battle called the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And the Battle of Dien Bien Phu is going to be a French defeat and a victory for Ho Chi Minh. He is able to establish a communist government within the north. And in the southern states, or the southern region, there's an attempt to create a democracy. So the United States, of course, goes in to support that democracy, going back to containment, to the Truman Doctrine, to all those things from the Cold War. And that leads us into the Vietnam War. Vietnam War technically begins around 1954 when we go in to try and shore up the South Vietnamese, the anti-communist groups. And then we dedicate more and more resources in an attempt to prevent South Vietnam from becoming communist. And we're fighting the forces of Ho Chi Minh in North Vietnam, the communist forces. And of course, as you know, were eventually forced to withdraw from Vietnam, and Vietnam in 1975 becomes a full-fledged communist nation. Now, if we go to Africa, we'll see the British Gold Coast, which is also, well, today is known as Ghana. So in the imperial times, it was referred to as the Gold Coast, or the British Gold Coast. In today's world, is called Ghana. And we have this leader named Kwame Nkrumah. I apologize for that. Now, what he does is he pushes, obviously, an anti-Western, pro-nationalist agenda for his people. And that's what eventually leads to the Ghana independence. But he also subscribes to this idea of what we call Pan-Africanism. So Pan-Africanism is the idea that all these African nations, all these African colonies that are breaking away from the European control in the 1960s and the 1970s, they have a vested interest in coming together to support one another economically and militarily. So what he's trying to create is kind of a sense of the African continent united together because they all have something in common. They have been exploited by Western businesses. They need to modernize their economy in order to compete with the globe. So Nkrumah's idea, or Nkrumah's vision, is to bring them together in sort of a united front, if you will. Now, the other thing about Nkrumah is that he is a socialist, and he's very sympathetic to the communist countries of the world. He has a close relationship with the Soviet Union, with communist China. He's eventually going to visit North Vietnam. So he's very much connected to that side of the Cold War, to the communist side of the Cold War. And he attempts to implement socialist reforms and socialist economic policies within Ghana, which is going to be another feature that we'll talk about later. In 1966, there's an overthrow of Nkrumah as he is visiting China or North Vietnam. He's on an official state visit in Asia. And while he's away, there's a military coup that puts the military in power of Ghana. And Nkrumah is not going to be allowed to return to Ghana. So this coup is going to get rid of a socialist / communist leaning government. And in its place will be a military rule for about 3 years. And then it will segue into an anti-communist party. This coup of 1966, you might guess, had the involvement of the CIA. So again, the United States, here's another example of the Cold War intersecting with decolonization. And the CIA certainly helped and supported the leaders of the coup. It's not to say that the United States masterminded it, but they certainly supported it. And as a result, Ghana is going to get rid of the man who ushered in the independence for Ghana. In Egypt, we have a general named Nasser. And in 1952, he's going to overthrow the Egyptian monarch. So the Egyptian monarch is very much in league with the Western, British, United States. He's very much connected to Western politics. And Nasser is going to overthrow him on the basis of the anti-Western, anti-imperialist agenda, anti-imperialist approach. So he's going to make an appeal, which is something Gandhi makes, something Ho Chi Minh makes, something Nkrumah makes. All four of these leaders are playing the anti-Western imperialism strategy. They're saying we have to pull together to resist this Western presence over us. So in 1952, Nasser becomes president, or becomes the leader of Egypt, eventually becoming president. You don't need to get into a lot of the terms of what he is. But he nationalizes the Suez Canal. So if we go back to the Suez Canal, in 1956, the Suez Canal was under the control of the British and under control of the French. Very much a European trade network. And what Nasser's going to do is basically say, that's in Egyptian land. Egypt will take control of this canal. That's the nationalization of the canal by the Egyptians. Now, this sparks a major crisis. Britain and Israel kind of team up to invade Egypt. The Soviet Union supports Egypt and will intervene. And that brings the United States into play. We call this the Suez Crisis of 1956. And during the Suez Crisis of 1956, the United States won, and basically we had missiles. The Soviet Union said, if Israel and Britain does not pull out of Egypt, then the Soviet Union starts launching missiles at London and at Paris. So now we have a potential nuclear war coming over this. And the United States decides that it's not interested in a nuclear war. There's your mutually assured destruction part. So they call on Britain and Egypt to pull out of the conflict. So Nasser, in a sense, wins this battle. And after this, he becomes a big leader in the Pan-Arab movement. And one of the things about the Pan-Arab movement is it's an attempt to unify the Arabs together to resist Western intervention and Western interference. And the other thing that this Pan-Arab movement is going to be is anti-Israel, which we'll talk about in a moment. So there are 4 leaders for you to be familiar with and the roles that they play in achieving decolonization. And also, it is interesting to see how it ties into the Cold War, at least 3 of the 4 of them. India, of course, becomes part of that non-alignment movement and just stays out of the Cold War altogether. Now, the way these colonies secured their independence, there's really 3 different ways. The first way is through a negotiated settlement. And this is where leaders of the colony and the mother country sit down and negotiate what the post-colonial power world will look like. So they, representatives from both sides sit down, they hammer out a constitution, they hammer out kind of the way government will be set up, and then there's an announcement of the day that the British or the French will leave the colony and the colony will now have independence. We see this happen in India. We see this happen in the Gold Coast, which of course is later Ghana. And then it also happens in the French West African colonies. So all 3 of those are negotiated settlements, negotiated withdrawals, if you will, of the European states. And the reason that the European states are getting out is because they don't have the resources to maintain control. And World War II had done that much damage. On the other hand, there's your armed conflict approach, where nationalist groups simply rise up against the mother country and drive them out. You're going to see this in Algeria against the French. Algerians are going to come together and militarily drive out the French. It's really that simple. In Angola, we're going to see revolutions that are going to drive out the Portuguese, eventually in 1975. And as you might recall from the Cold War lecture, Angola will go into a civil war, and the United States will take the anti-communist side, and the Soviet Union will take the communist group. And that will escalate. So that's getting back to this idea that independence is nice, but governing is a lot more difficult. And then, of course, Vietnam, the actions of Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese Communist Nationalist Group, driving out the French in Dien Bien Phu, and then fighting back against the Americans throughout the Vietnam War, to the point that at some point we withdraw from Vietnam, which eventually leads to a unified Vietnam under the communist flag. And that's how it remains today. So those are your examples of armed conflict. And then the last thing talks about challenges to imperialist boundaries. So this is kind of a consequence, in a lot of cases, of negotiated settlements, where some people aren't happy with the negotiated settlement. So they begin to resist and they begin to fight a new fight in the process of decolonization. And so these challenges to imperialist borders or boundaries are very important. Because in a way, if you think about Africa, for example, the Berlin Conference just kind of arbitrarily drew lines and drew borders across the continent of Africa. These are not borders that were made up by Africans and by the African history. These were borders imposed upon them by the Europeans. So when decolonization happens, you have ethnic groups who have been separated who want to reunite and cross those boundaries. You have other groups where the ethnic groups are kind of jammed together in one colony and they want to divide themselves and create two separate states instead of the one state that has been created. Usually one group wants to keep it, the other group wants to break away. So you get a lot of these infightings that starts to happen within these former colonies. And what were once allies turn into rivals, turn into enemies. We start seeing civil wars, we start seeing wars between new nations. It becomes a challenge throughout the 60s and the 70s. And in a lot of ways, there's still lingering tensions that still have to get that still have to get resolved. So in the case of South Asia, you know that the Muslim League are going to be big advocates for Pakistan. But one of the things that the Muslim, we'll talk about that next. So the Muslim League says, we don't want to live within one country where we're going to be in the minority. We want our own country where the Muslim population of South Asia can establish a government to their liking. And that's what leads to the creation of Pakistan in 1947. In Nigeria, you have an example of ethnic groups that compete for power and have different views of what the future should look like. And there is the Biafra secession movement. So there's an ethnic group in southern Nigeria that wants to break away. The ruling group is in northern Nigeria. Southern Nigeria has oil deposits, they have a lot of natural resources, so the northern part is not going to let them go. And that's going to lead to a civil war within Nigeria that eventually leads to the northern part winning, but it still shows how these tensions can escalate into conflict. And then lastly, I know it's Canada, but the Quebecois separatist movement. So if you know anything about Canada, you know that Quebec is different than the rest of Canada. Quebec has a very strong French heritage, whereas the rest of Canada has a very strong British heritage. So after Canada becomes a Commonwealth, kind of independent from the British Empire, there's a movement within Quebec to break away from Canada and form its own nation because the culture is so much different. Now, eventually, some separatist groups are going to engage in terrorism and become more violent to these means or to these ends. And eventually, the separatist movement is going to ultimately fail. But that does become another example of how Canada gets their independence as a negotiated settlement. And then you have an ethnic minority, in a way, in Quebec, who wants to break away from Canada. Okay, and we see this all throughout the globe where these ethnic minorities, you know, they've been lumped in with this colony for a century. The colony gains its independence, and then this ethnic minority goes, well, we want out. And then the newly formed government doesn't let them out. And that devolves into conflict and war. So that's something to be aware of as another item with decolonization. Now we move on to a different topic, the newly independent states, which is a second topic. And we're going to talk about, I think, 3 different parts to this. First part is that there is redrawing of political boundaries, which causes conflict. And that kind of laps over, is that the right word? That kind of blends in with the last topic I was just talking about. But one of the new political boundaries that's drawn, that's very important, is the creation of Israel in 1948. So if you remember from previous lectures, there has been a Jewish migration movement starting in the 1890s. We called it the Zionist movement, that has been moving into the state of Palestine. And it starts as a trickle, but gradually starts to grow in numbers. The Palestinians, who are Arab Muslims, most of them are Arab Muslims, resent the presence of these Jewish settlers. And so conflict starts to erupt in the 1910s, 1920s. After World War I, with the decline of the Ottoman Empire, the British come in and establish control over the Mandate of Palestine. So the British are trying to keep these Palestinians and Jewish settlers apart, but they're engaging in battle. They're engaging in conflict. The British are showing a clear favoritism to the Jewish settlers with the Balfour Declaration of 1917. Then we get to World War II. And after World War II, as the world finds out about the Holocaust, we see two things happen. One, the surviving European Jewish people are going to either go to the United States in a lot of numbers or go to Palestine in a lot of numbers. Those become the two destinations for a lot of the European Jewish migration after World War II. The numbers are swelling. And also, because of the Holocaust, there's a global sympathy to the Jewish people and a desire to create a homeland for these Jewish settlers. And that, of course, is going to be Israel. So the United Nations, the British, cannot keep these two rivals apart. The Palestinians and the Jewish settlers are fighting each other. The British don't have the resources because of World War II to maintain the peace. And so they turn it over to the United Nations. And the United Nations passes Resolution 181, which creates two states. They take one chunk of land and they say, this shall be Israel. This is for the Jewish settlers. And they take another chunk of land and they go, this shall be Palestine. And this is where the Arab Palestinians will live. Now, almost immediately, there's a war. In 1948, the day that Israel was recognized as an independent state by the UN, Palestine declares war on Israel, as do 5 other Arab nations. And now we have the Arab nations that are surrounding Israel, and Israel developing a rivalry and a number of conflicts throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. It's still going on today. So this Arab-Israeli war, one of the big things that happens is that Palestine is going to disappear from the map. Israel is going to expand some of its borders and take over chunks of Palestine, while Jordan and Syria are also going to expand into Palestine. And now the Palestinian people are viewed by the Arabs as a people without a home, as a displaced people, or as refugees. And the Palestinian refugee camps start to grow. And then in the 1960s, in 1967, and then it's a long story, but 1967, there's another war where Israel expands itself into the Sinai Peninsula, which is taking land from Egypt. The big thing to know about the expansion of Israel is that their justification is that they are surrounded by hostile forces, countries that refuse to recognize Israel's right to exist. So Israel says we need buffer zones between us and our adversaries. So Israel begins to expand its borders, absorbing more of what used to be Palestine. And that's where you get into the issue today. Now in Southeast Asia, going to what used to be French Indochina, we get the state of Cambodia. So Cambodia in 1953 is going to become an independent state. But it's going to get caught up in the Vietnam War. The North Vietnamese are often going to go into Cambodia to get away from the Americans. That creates a tension between Cambodia and North Vietnam. And in 1970, the government of Cambodia is overthrown, and we have a civil war going on in Cambodia. And the government that comes to power in Cambodia is a communist regime, the Khmer Rouge. And the Khmer Rouge is going to establish itself as a communist regime. This gets back to your spread of communism. And its leader is going to be Pol Pot. Pol Pot, and this is an important part, is going to engage in genocide. He's going to engage in state-sanctioned violence against his people. And between 1970 and 1975, we have mass killings, we have massacres under the Khmer Rouge. And you're talking about political dissidents, you're talking about ethnic minorities within Cambodia. That's why I use genocide. You have this massive state violence that the communist regime is carrying out against its own people. And when it's all said and done, the number is going to be about 2 million people killed. And if you look at 2 million, you go, well, there's bigger examples of genocide through history. I would point out that the 2 million killed in Cambodia represented 1/4 of the country's population. That's how extensive these massacres were. Now, in 1978, Pol Pot decides to try and invade Vietnam. And that leads to Vietnam occupying Cambodia. And eventually Pol Pot just runs away. And from 1978 to 1992, Vietnam occupies Cambodia to the point that in 1992, Cambodia is able to hold its first free elections. And Vietnam is going to withdraw in 1992. So again, that's another example. Here's a new state, but there's not a political stability. And you eventually get Vietnam invading to provide stability. And then finally, India-Pakistan tensions over Kashmir. Now let's just back up and talk a little bit about India and Pakistan. What happens is there's a big push to separate after the two-state solution. So India and Pakistan is created, and there is hostility and tension between the Muslim population and the Hindu population. And Hindus living in what is now Pakistan are going to be pushed out to India. And likewise, Muslims, especially along the Pakistani border, are going to be pushed out of India. And usually this is happening at the level of the people. There isn't necessarily an orchestrated effort by the governments to do this. This is people going to violence against one another. You're going to have a great deal of violence. In fact, Gandhi, who is that symbol of independence, is going to speak out against this Muslim-Hindu split that's becoming more and more violent. He's going to engage in hunger strikes against the violence, because the one thing that everybody can agree on is that Gandhi's a good man, and nobody wanted to be responsible for Gandhi's death. So sometimes the tensions would abate, sometimes they would swell back up. And at one point, Gandhi is going to be assassinated by a radical Hindu who does not accept peace with the Muslims, a peaceful coexistence with the Muslim population. He sees Gandhi as somebody who's favoring the Muslims. So to him, he goes, Gandhi needs to go. So the assassination of Gandhi is really where this all starts to really fall apart, because now there's not that unifying figure anymore. These tensions are going to grow into a competition over a chunk of land called Kashmir, which is up in the northwest part of the border of Pakistan and India. And Kashmir is going to be a bone of contention. It's going to lead to wars between India and Pakistan frequently between its creation and the 1970s. What changes in the 1970s is that India develops the nuclear bomb, and then Pakistan soon follows. And now you've got these two countries who are right next door to each other, have a lot of animosity, have this piece of land that they're both competing over, and both of them are armed with nuclear weapons. And so that's going to be a lingering tension, to say the least, in these newly independent states. All right, next, with these new independent states, this is going to get a little bit more general. New governments were active in economic policies. So the new governments that take over, they want to build up and promote development of their nations, because they look at the West European nations, they look at the United States, and they go, in order for us to compete, in order for us to be truly independent, we have to be much more developed than we are. So the government is going to direct these developments. We're going to have very much state-sponsored and state-run economies. And many of these former colonies are going to go the path of socialism. So you're going to see in the socialists, and that doesn't mean that they all side with the Soviet Union, but they have elements of socialist policies in an effort to create a more modern economy. And the results are extremely mixed. These newly independent states, a lot of their economies are going to still rely on exporting to the West. And in this sense, what we call this period of time is neo-colonialism. And that means a new form, or neo-imperialism. In other words, the British, the French, the Americans, they don't establish the empires of the 19th century. But their economic clout forces these former colonies to rely on them. So the question is economically, how independent are these new states? All these governments are working to create more independence for their respective countries. And that's why I say you see a lot of socialist agendas and socialist programs that come out. You also see a lot of authoritarian approaches, a heavy-handed ruling government, because they go, in order for us to win, we all have to stay on the same page. So that's going to lead to a cut down on protest, resistance. And there's going to be military coups in some of these former colonies who feel that socialism is getting out of control, or the United States is supporting these coups in an effort to stop the spread of communism. But the biggest thing to me for this particular topic is migration patterns. And we've talked about this before. If we go back to the first unit, we had this concept of diasporic communities. And then if we go to the third unit, where we were talking about imperialism, we had this idea of ethnic enclaves as cheap labor was migrating through the world. With decolonization in the 1960s and the 1970s especially, we see this big mass movement of people to the metropole. A metropole is the mother country. That's all a metropole is. So there's colony and there's mother country. So when that relationship is broken, what happens is that some of the people from the former colony immigrate or migrate to their former home or their former mother country, the metropole. So some examples are South Asians to Britain. I believe the English population is about 7 to 8% South Asians, either from India or from Pakistan. And they migrate into Britain. So that's an example of, here's India with its independence, and there's some people who go, nah, I'd rather be in Britain. And they migrate for the same reason all immigrants migrate: economic opportunity, to flee political persecution, opportunities for employment, better economic opportunities, which I said at the beginning. So you get this idea that the migration follows for the same reasons that all migration follows. And so when you have India and Pakistan, on the verge of nuclear war, you have people getting out of there for their own safety. And where do they go? They go to the country that has influenced India the most. They go to Britain. So that's one example. The Vietnamese to France. And actually it's, with the Vietnamese, they make up about 5% of the French population. And they represent the largest Vietnamese population within West Europe. So we have a lot of Vietnamese people who are getting out of Vietnam because of all the conflict. I mean, from 1954 to 1975, there is a great deal of insecurity and instability. And there's a lot of Vietnamese people who just decide, I'm getting out of here. Now, some of them come to the United States. And if you don't mind for a second, I want to just share a personal experience. When I was growing up here in Montgomery County and I was going to school at Magruder High School, I went there from 1988 to 1992. And in my class were a number of Vietnamese students who were born in 1974 in Vietnam, and as babies were fleeing Vietnam altogether. Now, there was one girl that I knew through middle school and into high school. She was the president of our class. And I've recently connected to her on Facebook, and she and her family live in France. So that idea of the Vietnamese connection to France and the migration patterns is something to take into account. So they're migrating within the context of the Vietnamese upheaval of post-World War II. And I had a number of friends whose parents got out of Vietnam because of that conflict. and they were babies on boats getting out of Vietnam and coming to the United States. The Algerians, even though Algeria fights for and achieves its independence from France, there were Algerians who supported the French. So after that conflict, Algerians are going to go to France. And if you ever look at the French World Cup soccer team, you'll see a number of Algerians on that team. So the Algerian population in France, there's a significant percentage of the French population is Algerian. And that represents this migration pattern. And then Filipinos to the United States. The Philippines become an independent state after World War II. If you remember, Philippines used to belong to, well, the Philippines were once on its own, and then Spain conquered it. Then the United States takes the Philippines from Spain in the Spanish-American War, and then the Japanese take it from the Americans in World War II. We take it back, and then after World War II, we kind of get out of there, and the Philippines becomes its own independent state. Well, during that period of time, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, and on, Filipinos do migrate to the United States. So this migration pattern is something that continues today. I mean, it's you still have these migration patterns going on, and that's connected to decolonization. All right, so the next thing, resistance to power structure. Now, this is a topic that kind of gets shoved into Unit 8. And the idea is for you to see that, you have this decolonization, but you also have, the decolonization represents a challenge to the power structure of imperialism and to the power structure of global colonialism. And then we see other examples of resistance. So there's different types of resistance. One would be a nonviolent resistance, and that is best exemplified within Gandhi. Gandhi's homespun movement, if you remember from a previous lecture, where he encouraged the Indian people to make their own textiles and own cotton, to spin their own cotton into thread and make their own clothes as a way of undermining British business interests. And the Salt March, which was a march that Gandhi engages in to go harvest his own salt, which was forbidden by the government. So these type of protest movements, we call that nonviolent. Gandhi is going to influence the United States Martin Luther King Jr. And the civil rights movement that you've studied in US history and you've studied well before you got to this class is steeped within nonviolence. And remember that nonviolence does not mean passive. Passive means I just do nothing. These were active forms of resistance. There was planning, there was organization. It was confrontational and it was challenging, but it did not rely on violence to achieve its end. And then in South Africa, and this is an important one that we're going to start working into the story, we have Nelson Mandela. So South Africa, if you remember, was once settled by the Dutch. So we had a descendants of the Dutch that we call the Boers. And the Boers use African labor to build up, a country basically that is ruled by the Boers, but is supported through the labor of the Africans. And initially that is enslaved labor, and then it grows into very cheap labor. Britain comes in and establishes control over the South African colony. Now in 1948, South Africa becomes an independent state. But that independence, well, I apologize, it could be 1910, it depends how you look at it. But the point is that by 1948, the white minority in South Africa establishes what's called apartheid. And apartheid means separation. So the white descendants, the white population will separate themselves from the non-white population, most of whom are African. But Indians, who, if you remember that migration pattern, Indians were also discriminated against and segregated. So you have this idea that there's a very rigid segregation of the two groups. And, if you look at the Jim Crow laws of the South, we see a form of apartheid. But I'm going to say that the South African apartheid was much more rigid than what we see in the Jim Crow apartheid system. So there's degrees, right? the idea is that in the United States, this was largely state and local governments. For South Africa, this was a national policy. Okay. And you can talk about with the United States the existence of what we call de facto segregation, a segregation that was social norms but was not enforced by the law. Apartheid is the law enforces the segregation system. Nelson Mandela, he begins as a violent resistance, but then he develops into a non-violent approach. This eventually gets him arrested for, as a political prisoner. And from 1964 until 1990, he's going to be a prisoner, in one of the harshest prisons of South Africa. When he emerges in 1990, that's signaling the end of the apartheid system. When I was in high school and when I was in middle school, ending apartheid was a big movement, internationally to end apartheid. And there were boycotts of South Africa. There was a lot of international pressure on South Africa. And Nelson Mandela was the face of that anti-apartheid movement. Now, in other cases, we see violent resistance to power structures. One example is the Shining Path in Peru. So when we talk about violent resistance, we often are referring to terrorist activity. So the Shining Path in Peru, the Shining Path are a communist group that is seeking to take control of Peru. And they're going to resort to terrorist tactics, which is going to inflict heavy casualties on the civilian population of Peru. About 30,000 Peruvians are going to die because of the actions of Shining Path. And Al-Qaeda, which is a terrorist group that is based out of Saudi Arabia, it goes to Afghanistan. It's based out of fanatical Islam. And of course, Al-Qaeda it isn't so much fighting a country that controls them. They're engaged in what they see as an international struggle against the forces of the West. So we still see in the 1990s and the 2000s an anti-Western group that is focused on declaring war on the West and particularly the United States. And of course, Al-Qaeda is going to spearhead the attacks of 9/11 on the World Trade Center and on the Pentagon. And we are still dealing with the fallouts of that particular attack. Now, and we could talk about other examples of violent resistance. These are just two that I'm highlighting. You could talk about the Irish Republican Army in the 1970s, the 1980s, and the 1990s. The IRA becomes associated with terrorism. And again, if you'll indulge me in one little personal story, I remember taking a group of students to Britain, and we were in London, and we met with a member of parliament. And the member of parliament came out to talk about, the way the British government works and how it's better than the American government. It was all in good fun. And a student who didn't understand the idea of diplomatic tact asked the question of, when will you release the Irish patriots from prison? He's talking about the IRA. And this member of parliament didn't miss a beat. He said, those men are not patriots. Those men are terrorists. They blow up civilians because they don't get what they want. And that's terrorism. That has nothing to do with democracy. And we reject that group altogether. They're not seen as heroes. They're seen as people who will use civilians to try and achieve an end that they can't achieve democratically. So we have a lot of examples of these violent resistance groups. And usually we would label it with terrorism. Israel has to deal with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO, who resort to hijacking planes and taking hostages in demands that Israel has to meet. So, the 1970s and the 1980s had a lot of terrorism. The 1990s and the 2000s and the 2010s has taken that terrorism to a whole new level in terms of what the terrorists are willing to do and who they're willing to hurt in attempting to achieve their goals. Now, there is a reaction to these forms of resistance. And the reaction is usually to squelch it. The reaction is usually to crack down on it. So, for example, we haven't talked about this, but in the 1930s, a fascist dictator in Spain named Francisco Franco is going to take power in Spain. And he's going to do this by crushing the democratically elected Communist Party. So the communists come to power, and then Francisco and his fascist followers go into a civil war against the communists, eventually defeating them. And the way Franco is going to deal with political dissent is to imprison them, to put them into camps, prison camps, to execute them, to eliminate them. So Francisco Franco, he goes to about the 1970s. So he goes for about 40 years. And he looks very much like a Nazi regime and like an Italian fascist regime, except for he goes beyond World War II. In South Africa, people like Nelson Mandela and other parts of the anti-apartheid movement are going to be systematically attacked by the police state of South Africa. So South Africa is going to use its police forces to crack down on any semblance of protest and resistance to keep the anti-apartheid movement in check. There was a movie in the 1980s about a leader of the anti-apartheid movement named Steve Biko, who was arrested and jailed and died in police custody. And his death became a rallying cry for the anti-apartheid movement to escalate its tensions with South Africa. And then lastly, the buildup of the military-industrial complex. Now, this doesn't really follow kind of the state violence, in the name of security. So that's what we're really talking about in letter C, is the idea that states justify violence against its own people in the name of national security. And this isn't just happening in Peru or in the Middle East, or, it's happening throughout the world. Uganda is going to have a military dictator who takes over and kills off thousands of Ugandans, in the name of police security or in the name of security for the group. So in the United States, we have what's called the buildup of the military-industrial complex, because to us, certainly the civil rights was seen by some groups as a threat. But the biggest threat was the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union had a nuclear arsenal that we had to keep up with. That's your arms race. So what happens is that the government starts to spend more money on military projects. And the military projects, of course, are contracting out to private developers, weapon developers. Well, these weapon developers, these private businesses, these industrial, businesses are making more money off of the Cold War. So now people are getting jobs because of this conflict. And now a relationship develops between the military and the private industries that are building the weapons for the military. And if we decide to reduce spending in the military, that means thousands of people are going to lose their job. So in a way, these industries are incentivized to keep the military spending on them. So there's a lot of pressure on the government to keep military spending up. And Dwight D. Eisenhower, our president from 1952 to 1960, warned of this growing military-industrial complex and that it could possibly present a threat to our democracy down the road, because their interest in maintaining that spending may circumvent the democratic process. So that is your lecture on decolonization. We shoved 3 topics into it. We talked about the leaders of decolonization. We talked about the methods of decolonization. We talked about the conflicts within these new states. And we talked about global resistance to power structures. In other words, the push back against the way things are established and set up. And that is where we will leave Unit 8. So now that we're done with Unit 8, we only have one more unit before we can start reviewing for the exam. So until then, I will see you next time. And as always, bring all your questions to class, and we will continue to work to getting ready for the exam. Have a good night.